Right, I'm going to give you a bit of a perspective from the local authority drainage engineer's view on the application as it actually came forward, and also my involvement, and also some other members of the design team, their involvement actually in the project as it went through the planning application process. And then I'm going to provide a little bit more detail on a couple of the reserved matters applications that are being that have achieved approval and are actually starting on site pretty soon. So the Northwest Cambridge development was quite interesting, because we seem to have quite a few pre-app stages as well, which was quite unique to the development, and it was great for us in the local authority as well, because we did get to see some parts of the Cambridge University that we haven't seen before, and it was quite an interesting experience as well, because everyone was involved at a very early stage. So the university were presenting their vision, and the local authority were there to understand the vision that the university had, and also to express to the university what our expectations were of the development as well. And that was very much everyone was actually there at these very early stages. So you had the engineers there, you had the landscape architects, the urban designers, ecologists, cycling and walking officers, those responsible for waste management and waste collection. We were all there at the very early stage before effectively pen was put to paper. And before the master planning really took off. So it was a good experience from my point of view, because at that stage when things are very fluid, as a local authority we do have a chance to influence and to express to the developer what our expectations are, and what's we would like to see from the development. And also it gives us a good chance to try and relate some of the constraints that we're aware of, and also to provide some of that local knowledge as well to the design team, who may not be that familiar with particularly with I would say the quirks of Cambridge, let's put it that way. And it was at this stage where we were very much discussing it was the high level vision for the development, and that very much encompassed the sustainable drainage and the potable water strategy at that very early stage. And when we started down the proper pre-app stage, again, it was we used to turn up to meetings, and there were a huge number of people from both sides, both from the university and both from Cambridge City Council and from South Cambs and from the County Council as well, all sitting around the table, all having those early pre-application discussions. There wasn't a huge amount of individual consultants talking to individual officers from the local authority off in some darkened room discussing drainage. It was very much done as an integrated approach, and an integrated approach really paid dividends in trying to ensure that the landscape architects fully understood the requirements of the engineers fully understood the requirements of the ecologists. The urban designers were fully aware of the requirements to when they're looking at massing and looking at the overall master planning of the site, of to allow enough space to put in a lot of the strategic features. So it was that early engagement which I think has led to quite a successful scheme. At the pre-application stage, this is for the outline application. This is where we generally had the discussion in and around the flow and volumetric runoff, where the controls were, where the discharges were actually going to be going into the wash pit brook, what the potable water strategy was, what the landscaping would actually look and how that would relate to any of the surface water drainage features. And also the adoption strategy. It's because it's quite an interesting site and quite an interesting from my point of view, because the university does actually want to retain a lot of the land, which is quite an unusual position. You know, if you look at some of the other development sites in and around Cambridge, developers can't wait to get rid of a lot of the land. So to actually have a developer who has a vested interest actually in what is actually being delivered on site, it was really quite refreshing. And at the outline pre-app stage, and there was more than one of them, and there was quite a few, and generally the discussions were around what the submission requirements were actually required. From the local authority and from the Environment Agency, and also we came to an agreement on the level of detail that was actually to be provided with the application. To give you a bit of an example of that, the two-stage channel and the downstream flood risk reduction scheme was slightly in advance of the landscape proposals. So we agreed an approach where actually within the outline application an indicative proposal was provided to show that the scheme actually could be delivered on the site, which would then be subject to a reserve matters application, which would then provide the detail to show that it could, what the actual final proposals were for it to actually be delivered on site. So that gave us all some comfort that we could make a recommendation to that the outline application was to be approved based on the level of information that was supplied, but also it didn't hinder further design that was actually to be undertaken on the detailed landscape for the western edge. So, and when the outline application was actually submitted, when those very strong men brought in those very large boxes of reports and drawings, it was very much a question of, from my point of view, I had to keep one eye on the current application as it was actually coming forward, because I had to recommend for approval, what was actually being provided actually within the documentation. But also, I had to have one eye on the reserve matters applications that were actually going to be coming forward as part of the wider development moving forward, because what the strategic surface water drainage strategy did was to actually parcel up all of the individual lots across the site and provide a restriction. And I was very keen that the drawings actually within it were quite clear, not only for my benefit, to make life easier for me further down the line, but also to make life easier for some of the other developers that were actually coming on to pick up this information, so that they could easily understand it, not misinterpret it, and to then go forward to understand the requirements to deliver and design that reserve matters application. Also, when I am reviewing an outline application, I quite often will review some of the other documentation that's actually associated with it as well. So I won't limit what I'm actually looking at to the surface water drainage strategy or the potable water strategy or the foul water strategy as well. I will also be talking to the urban designers. I will also be talking to the landscape architects and looking at all of the information that's actually been submitted for that as well, to ensure that there's a coordination between all of the documentation. You'll quite often find that sometimes there's a requirement for the bins, for example, which might mean that something in terms of which can actually have an impact on what's being delivered in terms of the surface water drainage strategy, and it's good to actually understand that. And again, there might be aspirations in terms of what's being delivered for the landscape architecture, which again might actually have an impact on the surface water drainage strategy. And equally, what's actually being required for the surface water drainage strategy could potentially have an impact on what is what is being delivered actually in the landscape, and also what is being delivered for the physical aspect of the buildings and the development itself. So when it actually came down to the individual reserve matters, this was when a lot of the some very prestigious and very exciting architects actually became involved within the project, and again it was an opportunity for all of us to actually sit around the table and actually have our input, and again very much a design team approach. There was pretty much a local authority technical team. Part of the complexity with this development as well was that it did span over two different local authority boundaries, and so there were duplicate officers actually within each authority. And so we did actually come to an arrangement where one officer did actually take the lead from one authority and would report back to the other to try and keep some of the numbers down, and to also provide a bit of a consistent approach and feedback back to the developer. Again, there were multiple pre-apps, so at the early stages, where when there were discussions around the massing of the buildings and the actual layout on the site, again the whole of the local authority technical team was actually at that pre-application discussions to have our input, to make sure that we were happy with the actual layouts that were actually going to be delivered, and also that it wasn't going to impact on any proposals, particularly with the surface water drainage strategy and the landscape, because this scheme, particularly around the phase one and the local centre, is a very dense scheme, and what has been mentioned before is that there are a lot of services in and around this site, and there is quite a large requirement for each of the individual reserve matters to provide a significant amount of surface water attenuation. And that does require a lot of coordination. So it's the do you have enough room for your trees to grow? Is there enough space for the surface water? The potable water has to be on the other side of the road from the district heating. So there are all of these requirements that actually have to feed into the individual reserve matters application, and it's that coordination as well. And also as a local authority, we're also very concerned about the long-term maintenance of these features as well. So we will have a view and made our view known on how those features could be maintained, and wanted some form of assurance from the applicant within the application itself on how those features can actually be maintained for the lifetime of the development. And also, quite interesting on the North West Cambridge development, this is not something I've come across before as well, is that we had a ghost application phase, and that was all of the information was submitted as if it was a live application, and so we undertook a review of the application, provided all of the feedback and the recommendation, as if it was a live application, and that was where we checked everything against best practice. We were interrogating the calculations and all of the information that was actually provided, and also had a wider internal discussion internally to make an assessment actually of the application as it was actually coming forward. I think part of my role at that stage was to again, it was the coordination. Is the landscape information that's being submitted, did that actually coordinate with the surface water drainage strategy? I would highlight what was missing and agree what could be left and potentially be obtained via a condition, and then all that was wrapped up in a formal response actually to the applicant. And then at the actual application stage for the reserve matters, to be honest, this was very much a tick box exercise. It was just to review the feedback we gave at the ghost application stage to make sure that all of the recommendations and the queries we had actually had been addressed in the information that actually had been submitted, and this did actually speed up the application process. So the whole Northwest Cambridge planning application process was very heavily weighted towards the pre-application stage and resolving a lot of issues before the application actually was submitted. And when the application actually was submitted, there were very few real major issues that actually required resolving at that time, which I think did actually help speed up the application actually as it actually came through the system, because we have a limited resource at the City Council, and the university were firing planning applications at us left, right and centre. So we are at post-application stage at the moment, and so my general involvement is I do actually go out on site and undertake some on-site monitoring. I do check to see that what is actually being delivered is being delivered against the actual application drawings. I do actually have a relationship also with building control, because this is again a design and build scheme. The consultants who are working on some of the reserve matters applications are not the consultants who produce the information for the reserve matters application, and so there is sometimes a bit of an interpretation that is undertaken by the new consultant with the information and the surface water drainage strategy which was provided with the reserve matters application, and that has proved a little bit interesting. And then also as the designs actually have developed as well, there have been some further constraints that actually have come into play. For example, where crane bases are actually going to fit, and that has had an impact on where some of the attenuation features actually can be placed, and this would mean that there have been some post approval amendments and changes and refinements, which on a development of this size and this complexity is generally to be expected. And also one of my roles has also been, throughout the process, but particularly as soon as things start to happen on site, is to actually liaise with the public as well, to provide them with those particularly with that reassurance that there has been some form of oversight, because as Stuart mentioned, Cambridge residents, they're very interested, and they are very educated, and they are very involved in the whole of the development process, and they are very concerned, rightly so, that the university is doing what it actually has promised to deliver, and and my role has been to not persuade them, but to reassure them that through all of the information that the university has provided to the local authority, that essentially their flood risk, because that's generally where most of the concerns actually come from, is not actually going to be increased. So now I'm going to take you through a couple of the reserve matters applications. So you've seen a lot of the strategic elements throughout the site. So you've got the strategic lagoons with the strategic swales connecting into them. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the reserve matters. So the first one is lots M1 and M2, which is a residential lot, and that's Hill Residential. That's 240 dwellings. And it roughly equates to about 64 dwellings per hectare. And there are 4 discharge locations going into the strategic system, each of those at 5 litres per second. So this is a bit of an overview of the reserve matters. There are 3 large apartment blocks to one side, and all the rest are a combination of 4, 3, 2 and 1 bedroom dwellings. Integrated into development, you've got again some green fingers actually up through the site, which the surface water drainage actually connects into. Again, outside one of the rows of properties, you've got a swale which cars actually will drive over, and that picks up all the surface water runoff from that row of houses. Generally, all of the roads are permeable paving, which is great in terms of water quality, and that's really been made possible because the university is actually going to be retaining the ownership of the land, and therefore that can be delivered to a certain extent to a higher standard than what generally would be required by the county council. From this plan you can see that the majority of the residential properties, all those green blobs are actually green roofs, so they all actually have green roofs. You do have a series of green fingers actually going through the development, which that's where you actually have your swales connecting into it, and all of the highways are permeable paving, and also there is some elements of underground attenuation that is provided to provide that the storage requirements actually for this lot. There is also a significant underground car park actually associated with this reserve matters, and the podium deck above, which is at ground level, has some attenuation actually built into the podium itself. All of the apartments have green roofs, and all of it connects into the site-wide surface water drainage strategy and the strategic network. So generally you will find that all elements of the highway will have permeable paving, so one treatment stage or 2 depending on who you actually talk to, before it connects into the strategic swales, and then into the strategic ponds before it actually connects into the wash pit brook. We've got some cross sections here of the green street, indicating the swales with actually some bridges going over them. And again, integrated actually into the landscape. There's a nice picture of one of Bob's schemes, which has inspired the green street in this area with some seating.
5 minutes.
With lot 2, that's residential and commercial. There is 264 dwellings. These are all key worker. and 1,983 square meters commercial use. And this is 8.81 liters per second discharge into the strategic network. This is where it actually sits within the development as a whole. Gives you a bit of an overview. You've got the this is the market square here. You've got supermarket, and this is where the residential element will actually be. And there are features. This is some artist impressions of some of the sustainable drainage features in it. There are some wetlands, some rills. Again, there are brown roofs. And some features that pick up the flows generally from the rainwater pipes into a series of rills, which then cascade the water down into a series of wetlands before discharging off the site. And so this is give you an indication of the development itself. There actually are a few green roofs. Yeah, on this lot, on top of the bike sheds. But generally, the buildings themselves, they are all brown roofs, and then you've got this these series of rills down to a series of small wetlands with some attenuation prior to it connecting into the strategic drainage system in that location. And again, with the application, this is all taken from the design and access statement. There was give us an indication of how the features actually will be integrated into the landscape, and how individual features will work, how the surface water will actually be picked up and actually discharged into the rills. And to give you a bit of a closer view of actually what is actually happening on site, these are some of the swales which are actually being delivered on site at the moment. This is an existing water course which actually travels through the site, and that is a newt tunnel, which because there are great crested newts which are and present on the site, and some of these features, some of these wetlands here, have been designed not only as attenuation features but also as habitat for great crested newts as well. So in conclusion, I think what I've learned from the North West Cambridge development is that early consideration has generally led to better SUDs, and if you've got the opportunities, then maximise the amount of pre-app that you actually undertake, and also is that I think you really need that attention to detail in terms of the information that is actually coming forward. But don't worry about the calcs to a certain extent. A lot of what is being delivered in the North West Cambridge development is very much being driven by the landscape and the quality desires of the university and all of the stakeholders that are involved. So if you get all of those elements right, then the calcs should just be there to back up the design. It shouldn't necessarily be what is actually driving design in the first instance, and also make sure you follow through to construction to ensure that what actually has been promised is being delivered.
Thank you.